Chapter 1: Turkey, where continents argue and empires converge. Turkey does not begin as a nation, it begins as a fault line. Here, geography itself argues. Europe presses eastward, Asia pushes west. Seas collide, the Black Sea, the Aegean, the Mediterranean, turning land into passage, temptation, and battlefield. This is not a place that history passes through quietly. This is a place where history stops, negotiates, and then fights. Long before the word Turkey existed, Anatolia was already old. Hittite kings ruled here while much of Europe was still tribal. They built laws, archives, and treaties, some of the earliest written diplomatic agreements in human history. When their empire collapsed, others arrived almost immediately, as if the land itself refused to remain empty. The Greeks came next, not as conquerors at first, but as settlers hugging the coastlines. Cities like Troy, Miletus, and Ephesus became laboratories of myth, philosophy, and trade. Homer sang of war here. Herodotus learned to think here. Democracy, tragedy, and rational inquiry crossed Anatolia before they reached Athens in mature form. This was already a bridge of ideas, not just armies. Then came Rome. Rome did not merely conquer Anatolia, it integrated it. Roads stitched the land together. Cities flourished. Law replaced custom. When Rome split, this land did not fall into decline. Instead, it became something unprecedented. Byzantium, a Christian, Greek-speaking Roman empire that refused to admit Rome was dead. Constantinople rose where continents nearly touch. It was not just a capital, it was a statement. Whoever held this city controlled trade between worlds. For 1,000 years, Byzantium held, besieged, battered, but never erased. While Western Europe fractured after Rome's fall, Constantinople preserved law, theology, architecture, and imperial memory. But stability here is always temporary. From the east came Turkic tribes, nomads, hardened by steppe life, flexible in belief, ruthless in war, and adaptive in governance. They did not erase what they conquered, they absorbed it. Islam entered Anatolia, not as a blank slate, but as a conversation with Christianity, Roman law, and Persian administration. Out of this synthesis emerged the Ottoman Empire, one of history's most durable imperial systems. When the Ottomans captured Constantinople in 1453, it was not the end of an era alone, it was the beginning of another. The city became Istanbul, but it did not lose its function. It remained a capital of worlds. The Ottomans ruled not by uniformity, but by managed difference. Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived under one imperial roof. Languages multiplied, faiths overlapped, law bent instead of breaking. For centuries, this empire proved something radical, that diversity could be governed, not erased through structure. Yet even empires built on balance decay. By the 19th century, the Ottoman world strained under modern pressures: nationalism, industrial warfare, European imperialism, and internal stagnation. What had once been a flexible system became rigid. What had tolerated difference now feared fragmentation. The collapse after World War I was not just political, it was civilizational. Out of imperial ruins emerged a bold experiment: the Turkish Republic. Under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, Turkey attempted something rare and dangerous: to cut itself from empire, faith-based governance, and inherited hierarchy, and replace them with secular nationalism, law, and modern identity. But no land layered with this much history ever becomes simple. Turkey today still carries every version of itself: at once: Anatolian, Greek, Roman, Byzantine, Islamic, Ottoman, and modern, secular and religious, Eastern and Western, imperial memory and republican discipline. It is not merely between continents, it is between meanings. And that tension between inheritance and reinvention will define every chapter that follows. Chapter 2: Turkey, Anatolia, before empires, Hittites, myths, and the first orders of power. Before Anatolia became a bridge between empires, it was a laboratory of power itself. Long before Rome, before Greece, before Persia, this land learned a lesson that would echo for millennia. Power must be organized, justified, and remembered, or it collapses. Anatolia did not stumble into civilization late. It entered early, decisively, and with a clear understanding that survival required structure. At the center of this early world stood the Hittites. Emerging around the second millennium BCE, the Hittite kingdom rose not from myth alone, but from administration. Their capital, Hattusa, was not a ceremonial city, it was an archive. Thousands of clay tablets filled its libraries. Laws, treaties, prayers, military orders, and diplomatic correspondence. This was not a warrior culture improvising rule. It was a state writing itself into permanence. The Hittites understood something rare for their age, that violence alone could not sustain authority. Conquest had to be followed by agreement. Their most famous legacy, the world's earliest surviving international peace treaty, signed with Egypt after the Battle of Kadesh, was not an act of weakness. It was an admission of reality. Endless war drained legitimacy. Order required negotiation. Power, for the Hittites, was contractual. Their legal system reflected this balance. Punishments emphasized compensation over execution. Law was meant to stabilize society, not terrorize it. Even kings were constrained by ritual and precedent. Authority was not arbitrary. It was embedded in cosmic order. Religion reinforced this logic. Hittite belief was not centralized around a single god, but an entire assembly of deities: storm gods, sun goddesses, local spirits, foreign divinities, adopted without resistance. They famously called their land the country of 1,000 gods. This was not theological confusion, it was political intelligence. Conquest did not require erasing local beliefs, only incorporating them. Myths served governance. Storm gods battled chaos serpents. Fertility goddesses withdrew and returned, explaining famine and renewal. These stories were not escapism. They were explanations of power, stability, and crisis. When crops failed or enemies advanced, it was not randomness, it was imbalance. And imbalance demanded ritual correction. This worldview produced something rare: institutional humility. Kings ruled, but they also feared divine reprisal. They were executors of order, not its origin. Yet even the most structured systems break. Around 1200 BCE, the Hittite world collapsed amid the broader Bronze Age breakdown. Trade networks disintegrated, cities burned, records stopped. Scholars still debate causes: climate stress, internal revolt, invasions by the so-called Sea Peoples, but the result was clear: central authority vanished, and Anatolia did not fall silent. Instead, it fragmented into successor cultures: Phrygians, Lydians, Eurasians, each inheriting pieces of Hittite memory while experimenting with new forms of rule. The Phrygians turned kings into semi-mythic figures like Midas, blurring wealth, curse, and moral warning. The Lydians minted the first known coins, transforming trust into metal and power into exchange. The Eurasians built fortress states, emphasizing military architecture and hydraulic control. Anatolia became a mosaic of experiments. What united them was not ethnicity or language, but a shared understanding. Power must be anchored in ritual, economy, myth, or law. Naked force did not last here. It never would. Even myth preserved this lesson. The Trojan cycle set on Anatolian soil was not merely a Greek epic. It was a meditation on the fragility of heroic power. Troy fell not because it lacked strength, but because cunning outlasted might, and because internal trust collapsed. The story warned future rulers. Walls are useless if belief erodes. By the time Greek settlers arrived along the Aegean coast, they did not encounter barbarism. They encountered deep memory. Cities like Miletus and Ephesus did not invent inquiry from nothing. They inherited a land already accustomed to law, record-keeping, cosmology, and political restraint. Anatolia had already learned how civilizations fail and how they try again. This is the true prehistory of Turkey, not emptiness before greatness, but rehearsal before empire. The patterns established here: pluralism, legalism, negotiated authority, myth, as governance would be, absorbed by every power that followed. Persians would adapt them, Romans would systematize them, Byzantines would sacralize them, Ottomans would administer them. Nothing truly began without Anatolia's consent. The land remembers every attempt to rule it, and it judges each one by the same standard. Can you create order without destroying meaning? Chapter 3: Turkey, Greeks on the Aegean, Cities, Philosophy. And the birth of political thought. When the Greeks arrived on the western edge of Anatolia, they did not discover a blank shore. They encountered a land already trained in power, memory, and restraint. What they added was something new and dangerous: the idea that power could be questioned openly. Along the Aegean coastline, from Miletus and Ephesus to Smyrna and Halicarnassus, Greek settlers founded city-states, not as imperial outposts, but as political experiments. These were not kingdoms ruled by divine monarchs. They were palaeus communities, where authority was debated, contested, and, at times, redistributed. In Anatolia, Greek civilization found its sharpest edge. These Ionian cities were shaped by geography. The sea encouraged trade, not isolation. Wealth flowed not from land alone, but from exchange grain, olive oil, textiles, ideas. Merchants stood alongside aristocrats, sailors beside priests. Power could no longer hide behind lineage alone. It had to justify itself, and justification demanded language. In Miletus, thinkers like Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes asked a question that quietly dismantled mythic authority. What is the world made of? Not who created it, but what governs it. This was not atheism. It was something more radical: natural explanation. Lightning no longer required divine anger. It followed principles. Seasons were patterns, not moods, of gods. Once nature could be understood, society could be redesigned. Philosophy was born, not in temples, but in ports. Politics followed quickly. The Greek city-state was a fragile structure. Citizens debated law in assemblies. Magistrates were temporary. Tyrants rose not by divine right, but by promising stability during crisis, and fell when they overreached. Power became conditional. This was unprecedented. In Anatolia, these ideas matured faster than in mainland Greece. surrounded by older civilizations, Lydians, Persians, remnants of Hittite order, the Ionians, saw alternatives to kingship and imitation. They compared systems, they argued, they experimented. Ephesus embodied this tension. Dominated by the cult of Artemis, one of the most powerful religious centers of the ancient world, Ephesus balanced sacred authority with civic governance. The temple was not only a spiritual site, it was a bank, a refuge, a symbol of continuity. Religion did not disappear. It was institutionalized, placed alongside law rather than above it. Here, Heraclitus declared that everything flows, that conflict not, harmony drives reality. His philosophy mirrored Anatolia itself, a land where stability came only through managed tension. History, too, took shape here. In Halicarnassus, Herodotus wrote not as a court chronicler, but as an investigator. He compared cultures. He recorded contradictions. He admitted uncertainty. History was no longer propaganda, it was inquiry. Power could now be analyzed after it acted, not merely praised. This was revolutionary. Yet Greek Anatolia was never naive about power. When the Lydian kings rose, especially Croesus, whose wealth became legend, the Greeks did not romanticize monarchy. They traded with it, negotiated with it, critiqued it. Coinage, first minted in Lydia, transformed political trust into metal. Power could now be counted, taxed, accumulated, and stolen. Then came Persia. When the Achaemenid Empire absorbed Anatolia in the 6th century BCE, Greek cities did not vanish. They adapted, some resisted, some collaborated, some rebelled in the Ionian Revolt, learning the brutal limits of autonomy against imperial scale. The lesson was harsh but enduring. Freedom without coordination is fragile. Yet even in defeat, ideas survived. Persian rule tolerated local customs, languages, and councils. Greek political thought continued to circulate now, sharpened by failure. Democracy, tyranny, oligarchy were no longer abstract concepts. They were lived experiences with consequences. Anatolia became the testing ground where Greek ideals met imperial reality. This fusion would echo forward. Alexander would later claim to liberate these cities, but he inherited their contradictions. Rome would admire Greek philosophy, but govern with Anatolian pragmatism. Byzantium would fuse Christian theology with Greek reasoning on Anatolian soil. What began on the Aegean coast was not merely Greek civilization, it was political consciousness, the realization that laws are made by humans. Power can be structured, authority can be challenged, history can judge rulers. Anatolia absorbed these ideas and never released them. From this point forward, no empire ruling this land could rely solely on myth or force. It had to answer to priests, to citizens, to scholars, to history itself. This is why Turkey's soil does not simply host empires. It interrogates them. Chapter 4, Turkey, Persia, Alexander, and the struggle between empire and freedom. Anatolia did not choose between empire and freedom. It was forced to live with both. When the Achaemenid Persians absorbed Anatolia in the 6th century BCE, they did not arrive as destroyers. They came as administrators. Roads were built, taxes standardized, local elites preserved. Cities continued to speak Greek, worship their gods, and govern their daily affairs so long as tribute flowed and rebellion did not. This was empire as management, not annihilation. Persia understood something earlier. Empires often ignored. Power that crushes everything must rebuild everything. Power that tolerates difference can rule longer. Anatolia became a mosaic of satrapies, imperial provinces, governed by Persian officials but populated by Greeks, Lydians, Phrygians, Carians, and countless others. Law was layered, identity plural, loyalty negotiated rather than absolute. Yet this system carried a contradiction. Persia ruled vastness brilliantly, but it could not erase the Greek idea that political authority should be accountable. The Ionian cities remembered assemblies, councils, and civic debate. Even under imperial protection, the memory of autonomy remained, and memory is the most dangerous form of resistance. The Ionian revolt was not merely a rebellion. It was a philosophical collision. Greek cities rose not because Persia was cruel, but because Persian rule was impersonal. Decisions came from afar. Power was rational, efficient, and distant. The revolt failed militarily, but it clarified a truth that would shape Anatolia's destiny. Freedom without force is fragile, but force without legitimacy breeds unrest. Persia adapted. It punished rebellion, then reinforced tolerance. The empire endured. Then came Alexander. He crossed into Anatolia not as an administrator, but as a symbol. He framed his invasion as liberation, freeing Greek cities from Persian domination. In cities like Sardis, gates opened without resistance. Temples were spared. Local elites courted. But Alexander's freedom was not civic freedom. It was conquest, wearing Greek language. In Anatolia, Alexander moved faster than ideology could stabilize. He replaced satraps with loyal commanders. He demanded loyalty not to law, but to himself. Cities gained autonomy in name, but lost it in practice. Where Persia ruled through systems, Alexander ruled through presence. Charisma replaced bureaucracy, and charisma is short-lived. After Alexander's death, Anatolia fractured into Hellenistic kingdoms, Seleucids, Attalids, rival generals claiming fragments of a broken vision. Greek culture spread deeper than ever. Theaters, gymnasia, philosophy, language. Yet political instability grew. Freedom existed culturally, not structurally. Anatolia learned another lesson. Ideas can conquer without stabilizing power. The Persian model had been durable, but emotionally distant. The Alexandrian model was inspiring, but unsustainable. Between them, Anatolia became a laboratory for empire testing, whether rule should be orderly or heroic, tolerant or transformative. Neither answer endured alone. Greek cities under Hellenistic kings enjoyed intellectual life but lacked sovereignty. Taxes rose, armies marched endlessly. Local identity survived, but decision-making vanished upward. Empire had returned, this time speaking Greek, and the people noticed. By the time Rome entered Anatolia, the land was exhausted by kings claiming divine legitimacy and freedom while ruling absolutely. Rome's promise was not liberation or glory, it was order. Anatolia accepted Rome not because it loved it, but because it understood it. This was the deeper transformation Alexander unintentionally caused. He taught Anatolia that freedom without institutions collapses, and that empire without legitimacy invites rebellion. Anatolia no longer believed in pure models. It believed in balance. Persia offered stability. Greece offered thought. Alexander offered ambition. None alone were sufficient. From this struggle emerged a uniquely Anatolian political instinct, skepticism toward absolute freedom and absolute empire alike. Authority must be strong but justified. Law must exist but adapt. Power must rule but be questioned. This instinct would later shape Byzantine governance, Ottoman administration, and modern Turkish statecraft. Anatolia did not choose empire or freedom. It forged a third path, the art of surviving between them. Slavery persisted. Provinces paid more than Italy. Order existed, but justice remained asymmetrical. Anatolia felt this contradiction deeply. The more Rome promised universal order, the more people noticed those excluded from it. Law created stability, but also sharpened awareness of inequality. The empire could organize the world, but not morally satisfy it. This is where belief began to shift. In Anatolia's cities and countryside, new religious movements gained traction. Not because Rome persecuted them initially, but because Roman order left existential gaps. Law answered how to live together, but not why to live at all. Mystery cults flourished. Eastern religions spread. And eventually, a marginal Judean faith began to move through Anatolia's trade routes and urban networks. Christianity did not challenge Rome militarily. It challenged it conceptually. Roman law was external. Christian belief was internal. Rome disciplined bodies. Christianity addressed souls. The tension between the two would later reshape Anatolia entirely, but even before Constantine, the fault lines were forming. By the 3rd century CE, Rome itself began to strain. Borders stretched. Armies multiplied. Law expanded, but flexibility declined. What had once been adaptive order became rigid control. Anatolia, long practiced in surviving imperial transitions, sensed the shift early. Cities fortified. Local identities resurfaced. Allegiance to Rome remained, but faith in its permanence faded. When Rome eventually divided, it was Anatolia's eastern half that retained coherence. Not because it was more Roman, but because it had learned to outlast empires. Roman rule left Anatolia with enduring legacies, a legal mindset that valued structure, urban continuity, and infrastructure. The concept of authority beyond personality, the expectation that power must justify itself through order. Anatolia did not remember Rome as conqueror or liberator. It remembered Rome as discipline, a system that taught the land how to function as part of something vast, abstract, and rule-bound. Rome trained Anatolia for long endurance, but also prepared it for a deeper question. What happens when law survives, but meaning fractures? That question would define the next era. Chapter 7. Turkey, Turks, Islam, and the Remaking of Anatolia. Anatolia was not conquered by the Turks in a single movement. It was relearned, reshaped, slowly, through movement, belief, and adaptation. When Turkic peoples began entering Anatolia from Central Asia in the 11th century, they did not arrive as a unified nation. They came as tribes, warriors, migrants, and seekers, shaped by the steppe, hardened by mobility, and bound together loosely by Islam rather than ethnicity. The decisive rupture came in 1071, at the Battle of Manzikert. Byzantine defeat did not immediately destroy the empire, but it shattered its psychological hold over Anatolia. Borders blurred, authority fragmented, space opened. Into that space flowed the Turks. They did not erase Anatolia's past. They layered over it. The Seljuks, who emerged as the dominant power, understood something Byzantium had begun to forget. Control of Anatolia required not only fortresses and armies, but integration. Greek peasants remained on the land. Armenian communities endured. Cities continued their rhythms. What changed was the axis of meaning. Islam entered Anatolia, not only as a religion, but as a social system. Mosques, madrasas, caravanserais, and waqf endowments appeared across the landscape. These were not merely religious structures, they were infrastructure. They provided education, welfare, legal arbitration, and commercial stability. Where Byzantine authority had weakened, Islamic institutions filled the vacuum. This was transformation through function, not forced conversion. Many Anatolians did not convert immediately. Some never did. But Islam offered coherence in a fractured land. It provided a moral language for justice, charity, and order, one that resonated with communities exhausted by imperial taxation and distant rulers. Meanwhile, Turkic culture adapted as well. Nomadic traditions softened under sedentary life. Tribal loyalties merged with Islamic law. Persian administrative practices blended with Turkic military organization. Anatolia became a hybrid space where steppe pragmatism met settled civilization. This hybridity was crucial. The Turks who survived and thrived in Anatolia were not those who clung rigidly to nomadism, but those who translated themselves into a new environment. They learned farming, urban governance, architecture, and diplomacy. In return, they reshaped Anatolia's rhythms, introducing new patterns of land use, language, and social organization. Language shifted gradually. Turkish spread first among elites and soldiers, then through rural life. It absorbed Persian vocabulary, Arabic religious terms, and local expressions. Identity did not flip overnight. It drifted. Islam, too, adapted. Anatolian Islam absorbed Sufi mysticism, emphasizing inward devotion over rigid doctrine. Figures like Rumi embodied this synthesis, Persian-speaking, Anatolian-rooted, Islamic yet universal. His message was not conquest, but belonging. Come, whoever you are. This was not accidental. Anatolia needed a form of Islam that could heal plurality, not erase it. Yet transformation was not peaceful everywhere. Crusades tore through the land, turning Anatolia into a corridor of violence between Europe and the Levant. Byzantine attempts at reconquest destabilized regions. Mongol invasions shattered Seljuk authority in the 13th century, fragmenting power into small frontier principalities, beyliks. But fragmentation did not mean collapse. It meant experimentation. Among these beyliks, one would eventually outgrow the rest, not because it was the strongest at first, but because it mastered Anatolia's deepest lesson. Rule must be flexible, inclusive, and purposeful. The Ottomans emerged at the edge of worlds, between Byzantine towns and Turkic frontiers, between Christian villages and Muslim warriors. They learned to govern diversity early because they had no choice. Their Islam was pragmatic. Their identity was political. Their legitimacy rested not on lineage alone, but on delivery of order. By the time they expanded beyond Anatolia, the transformation was complete. Anatolia was no longer Roman, no longer Byzantine, no longer purely Greek, Armenian, or Persian. It had become Turkish Islamic, but not in a narrow sense. This new Anatolia carried Roman administrative memory, Byzantine imperial instinct, Islamic legal moral structure, Turkic social flexibility. It was a civilization built not on purity, but on accumulation. The Turks did not replace Anatolia's past. They became its next expression. And in doing so, they resolved a tension that had haunted the land since Persia and Alexander: the conflict between empire and freedom, faith and law, diversity and unity. Islam provided moral cohesion. Turkic politics provided mobility. Anatolia provided depth. Together, they formed a foundation strong enough to support one of history's longest-lasting empires. But endurance would bring new questions. What happens when a frontier society becomes a world empire? Can flexibility survive scale? Can inclusion endure absolute power? Those questions would define the next chapter. Chapter 8. Turkey, the Ottoman synthesis. Empire built on diversity. The Ottoman Empire did not begin as a grand design. It emerged as a solution, born on the margins of collapsing worlds. The Ottomans inherited a problem older than Anatolia itself: how to rule difference without destroying it. Their answer was neither forced uniformity nor chaotic tolerance. It was structured pluralism. This was the Ottoman synthesis. As the empire expanded across Anatolia, the Balkans, the Arab world, and beyond, it encountered languages, religions, laws, and customs too numerous to erase. Instead of replacing them, the Ottomans organized them. Empire became architecture. At the center stood the Sultan, warrior, lawgiver, and symbolic guardian of order. Beneath him unfolded a layered system of governance that balanced Islamic legitimacy with pragmatic inclusion. Sharia provided moral and legal foundations, but it did not rule alone. Customary law, Qanon filled gaps, regulated taxation, and stabilized daily life. Law was plural by design. Christians and Jews were not anomalies within the empire. They were recognized communities. Through the millet system, religious groups governed their internal affairs: marriage, education, worship under their own leaders. Loyalty to the state mattered more than belief. This was not equality. It was hierarchy without erasure. Non-Muslims paid additional taxes. Political authority remained Muslim. Conversion opened doors, but was not mandatory. What mattered was order, revenue, and stability. In a world obsessed with purity, the Ottomans chose function. Anatolia became the empire's administrative heart. Roads, caravan networks, and ports tied villages to global trade routes. Istanbul, reborn from Constantinople, was no longer merely a capital. It was a statement that empires could transform without forgetting. The Hagia Sophia embodied this synthesis. Neither erased nor frozen, it became a mosque without losing its architectural soul. Power did not destroy memory, it repurposed it. The Ottoman elite itself reflected diversity. Through the Devshirme system, Christian boys were taken, educated, converted, and elevated into imperial service. They became viziers, generals, administrators. Loyalty was cultivated through opportunity rather than lineage. This was radical and controversial. The state trusted structure more than blood. Identity became something one performed through service, not inherited. Economically, the empire thrived on regulation rather than exploitation. Land remained technically owned by the state, preventing feudal fragmentation. Peasants worked plots with obligations clearly defined. Stability mattered more than extraction. Culturally, Anatolia flourished. Mosques rose alongside churches and synagogues. Markets buzzed in multiple tongues. Poetry flowed in Turkish, Persian, Arabic, Greek. Sufi orders wove spiritual life into daily existence, softening authority with mysticism and community. The empire's strength lay not in crushing difference, but in making difference predictable. Yet, synthesis had limits. As the empire grew, administration thickened. Flexibility hardened into routine. What once adapted became tradition. What once absorbed became defensive. Military innovation slowed. European states centralized, industrialized, and ideologized. Nationalism emerged, force alien to Ottoman logic. The empire was designed for faith-based communities, not ethnic nations. Anatolia again felt the strain. Diversity, once a strength, became difficult to manage in an age demanding homogeneity. Reforms attempted to modernize without dissolving identity. Some succeeded. Many arrived too late. Still, the Ottoman synthesis endured for centuries because it answered Anatolia's deepest need: coexistence under authority. It proved that empire need not erase complexity to rule it, but it also revealed a truth that Anatolia would face again. Systems built for stability struggle in eras of rapid change. When synthesis meets modernity, something must give. The question was no longer how to rule diversity. It was whether diversity could survive the idea of the nation. That question would dismantle an empire and give birth to something entirely new. Chapter 9: Turkey Decline, Reform, and the Crisis of Empire. Empires rarely collapse from a single blow. They erode from misalignment. By the 18th century, the Ottoman Empire still controlled vast territory, commanded immense symbolism, and governed millions. Yet, beneath the surface, the machinery that once translated diversity into stability began to lag behind a rapidly changing world. The empire had been built for continuity. The modern age demanded adaptation at speed. Europe industrialized, armies professionalized, finance globalized, knowledge became specialized. Meanwhile, Ottoman governance remained rooted in negotiated authority, tradition-bound institutions, and a political culture that valued equilibrium over disruption. What had once been wisdom became inertia. Anatolia felt this crisis acutely. It was still the empire's heartland, but now also its pressure point. Tax burdens increased. Local notables gained power as central authority weakened. Janissaries, once elite soldiers, loyal to the state, resisted reform to protect their privileges. The empire's greatest strength had become its vulnerability. Institutional memory without institutional renewal. Ottoman leaders were not blind to decline. They diagnosed the problem correctly, but disagreed on the cure. Some believed moral decay was the root cause and called for a return to religious discipline. Others saw technical inferiority and demanded Western-style reform. A few understood the deeper truth. The empire's political logic itself was outdated. Thus began the Age of Reform. The Tanzimat reforms of the 19th century attempted something unprecedented, transforming a plural, faith-based empire into a centralized, legally uniform state without dissolving its identity. New laws promised equality before the law. Modern schools trained bureaucrats. Ministries replaced patrimonial rule. Conscription replaced ad hoc levies. On paper, this was modernization. In practice, it was existential negotiation. Reform threatened every established interest. Religious authorities feared secularization. Local elites resisted centralization. Non-Muslim communities welcomed legal equality but distrusted imperial sincerity. Muslims feared loss of status. No group felt secure. Anatolia became a laboratory of tension. Railways cut through villages. New courts challenged customary law. Western dress symbolized progress for some, betrayal for others. The state expanded its reach, but legitimacy lagged behind capacity. And beyond the empire's borders, pressure mounted. European powers no longer sought Ottoman cooperation. They sought Ottoman weakness. Capitulations hollowed out sovereignty. Debt trapped the treasury. Military defeats exposed fragility. Nationalist movements ignited across the Balkans, redefining loyalty from empire to ethnicity. This was the empire's deepest crisis. The Ottoman synthesis had been designed to manage difference through hierarchy and tolerance. Nationalism rejected hierarchy and demanded homogeneity. It did not ask to be managed. It demanded sovereignty. Anatolia watched as the empire lost territory, prestige, and confidence. By the early 20th century, reform had become desperate. Constitutionalism emerged as a final attempt to reconcile authority with participation. Parliaments convened, political parties formed, intellectuals debated identity fiercely. Were the Ottomans Muslims first? Turks, citizens, subjects of history, or authors of their own future? No answer satisfied all. Then came war. World War I did not simply defeat the empire, ended its grammar. Borders vanished, populations moved or were destroyed, trust fractured beyond repair. Anatolia became the final refuge of imperial memory and the battlefield of competing visions. When the empire collapsed, it did not leave behind clarity. It left behind questions. What replaces empire when empire was the only structure ever known? How does a land built on diversity survive an age obsessed with nations? Can reform salvage identity? Must identity be reinvented entirely? Anatolia stood at the edge of history again. But this time, there would be no synthesis. There would be a rupturand from it, a radical experiment. Chapter 10, Turkey, War, Republic, and the Reinvention of Identity. The Ottoman Empire did not fall quietly. It collapsed into fire, hunger, and disbelief. After World War I, Anatolia was not simply defeated, was disassembled. Allied powers occupied strategic cities. Foreign armies patrolled ports and railways. Maps were redrawn by distant negotiators who saw Anatolia not as a civilization, but as a problem to be divided. For the first time in millennia, Anatolia faced the possibility of political extinction. What followed was not inevitable. It was a choice. From the ruins emerged a new kind of struggle, no longer for empire, faith, or dynasty, but for sovereignty itself. The Turkish War of Independence was not merely a military campaign. It was a battle over meaning. Who had the right to define Anatolia's future? Mustafa Kemal Ataturk and his allies rejected the imperial grammar entirely. They did not seek to restore the Sultanate, reform the Caliphate, or negotiate imperial survival. They sought something unprecedented in Anatolia's history, a nation-state built on citizenship, not empire. This was revolutionary. For centuries, identity in Anatolia had been layered: religion, community, locality, imperial loyalty. Now it would be flattened into a single political identity: Turkish, not tribal, not religious, not imperial, civic. The Republic was born from war, but defined by rupture. The Sultanate was abolished. The Caliphate followed. Religious courts were dissolved. Law was secularized. Education centralized. Language reformed. Dress codes changed. Time itself was recalibrated from the Islamic calendar to the Gregorian. This was not gradual reform. It was civilizational surgery. Ataturk believed that survival required speed. Anatolia could not negotiate modernity slowly while surrounded by predatory powers. It had to leap forward, disappear. The Republic therefore imposed change from above, trusting that identity would follow institutions. The old synthesis was dismantled deliberately. Faith was removed from state legitimacy. Islam became a personal matter, not a political foundation. The state claimed neutrality but enforced secularism with authority. Religious orders were banned. Mosques came under state control. The public sphere was stripped of overt religiosity. For some, this was liberation. For others, it was alienation. Anatolia was again divided not by ethnicity or creed, but by tempo. Cities adapted faster than villages. Elites embraced reform, while rural life absorbed it unevenly. The Republic created citizens legally, but belonging emotionally took longer. Yet the transformation was real. Women gained legal rights, unmatched in much of the region. Education expanded. Infrastructure developed. A national narrative replaced imperial memory. History was rewritten to emphasize pre-Islamic Turkic roots and ancient Anatolian civilizations, reconnecting the land to a deeper past beyond empire and faith. The Republic sought continuity without nostalgia, but reinvention always carries cost. By erasing empire, the state also erased pluralism. The millet system vanished. Diversity was no longer organized, was silenced. Minorities were expected to assimilate or withdraw. Difference became suspicious. Unity was enforced. The nation-state demanded clarity. Anatolia had survived by layering identities. The Republic demanded singularity. Still, the experiment held. Against extraordinary odds, Turkey preserved territorial integrity, resisted colonization, and constructed a functioning state. In a region fractured by mandates and monarchies, it stood as proof that post-imperial reinvention was possible, but tension never disappeared. Secularism hardened into ideology. The military became guardian of the Republic's founding vision. Politics oscillated between openness and control. The question beneath every debate remained unresolved. Was Turkish identity a civic contractor, a cultural inheritance? Anatolia carried forward unresolved contradictions. A secular state governing a deeply religious society, a national narrative built on diversity's erasure, a modernizing elite speaking for a complex populace, a republic born from war. Defending peace through vigilance, the Republic solved the problem of survival. It did not solve the problem of belonging. And so Anatolia entered the modern era not as a finished project, but as an argument between past and future, faith and reason, unity and plurality. The empire was gone. The question now was whether a nation could carry the weight of a civilization.
Chapter 11: Turkey, Democracy, Coups, and the battle over the Republic's soul. The Turkish Republic was built to survive. Whether it could choose was another matter. After the founding generation passed, the state faced a dilemma no constitution could resolve on paper. How to reconcile popular will with a founding ideology forged under emergency conditions. Democracy was promised but guarded. Freedom existed but supervised. This tension defined modern Turkey. The introduction of multi-party politics in the mid-20th century did not simply expand participation. It challenged authority. Rural voters, religious conservatives, and marginalized voices entered the political arena, demanding recognition not just as citizens, but as cultural actors. For the first time, the Republic had to listen, and it did not always like what it heard. The military, inheritor of Atatürk's legacy and self-appointed guardian of secularism, intervened repeatedly, 1960, 1971, 1980 each time, claiming to restore order, protect the Republic, and reset democracy. Each intervention left deeper scars. Coups did not destroy the state. They disciplined society. Constitutions were rewritten. Parties banned. Intellectuals silenced. Yet elections always returned. This created a uniquely Turkish paradox. Democracy interrupted to save democracy. Authoritarianism justified as protection. Anatolia internalized contradiction as normal. Economic transformation accelerated during these decades. Urbanization reshaped society. Millions moved from villages to cities, carrying religious practice and communal identity into modern spaces. The state promoted secular public life, but could not control private belief. Political Islam emerged not as rebellion, but as representation. Parties rooted in religious values framed themselves as democratic, moral, and socially responsive, challenging the elite's monopoly on legitimacy. Each rise was met with institutional resistance. Each suppression produced deeper polarization. The Republic was no longer debating policies. It was debating itself. Was secularism a neutral framework, an imposed identity? Was democracy merely procedural, expressive of cultural will? Who owned the Republic, its founders, or its citizens? The 1980 coup marked a turning point. Repression was harsher. Society was reorganized more deeply. Ironically, it also accelerated religious revival by attempting to control it. State-sanctioned Islam expanded. Education blended nationalism and faith. The boundaries blurred. By the 1990s, Turkey was plural in practice, but fractured in trust. When a new political movement emerged in the early 2000s, promising democracy, economic growth, and reconciliation with religious identity, it resonated powerfully. Long excluded voices now claimed the center. At first, it appeared as resolution. Civil-military relations shifted. Coups receded. Negotiations with Europe advanced. Markets opened. Infrastructure expanded. Turkey projected confidence, regionally and globally. But power consolidated. Gradually, pluralism narrowed again, this time not in the name of secularism, but of stability, sovereignty, and national will. Institutions weakened, opposition constrained, media pressured. Democracy remained, but its substance thinned. The guardians changed. The struggle remained. Turkey learned that elections alone do not resolve foundational tensions, they merely rearrange them. The Republic's sole secular, Islamic, national, democratic remained contested. Anatolia had survived empires, invasions, and reinvention. Now it faced a quieter test: whether a society built on layers could tolerate open-ended disagreement. The question was no longer how to build a state. It was whether the state could trust its people and whether the people trusted the state. That unresolved struggle carried Turkey into the present.
Chapter 12. Turkey, between East and West. Power, identity, and an unfinished future. Turkey has never been between East and West in the way outsiders imagine. It has been made of both and fully accepted by neither. In the contemporary era, this condition is no longer geographical. It is existential. The Turkish Republic entered the 21st century carrying unresolved inheritances, imperial memory without empire, secular institutions governing a religious society, democratic procedures under pressure from centralized power, and a national identity forged through rupture rather than gradual evolution. Modern Turkey does not suffer from a lack of history. It suffers from too much of it speaking at once. Globalization intensified this tension. Economic growth tied Turkey to international markets. Urban skylines transformed. A new middle class emerged, confident, connected, and assertive. At the same time, global instability pulled Turkey back into the logic of hard power, borders, refugees, security, influence. The state responded by emphasizing sovereignty. Foreign policy shifted from alignment to assertion. Turkey no longer wished to be merely a bridge, sought to be a center. Relations with Europe cooled. Regional engagement deepened. History was reactivated as narrative capital. Ottoman memory re-entered public discourse, not as empire restored, but as dignity reclaimed. This was not nostalgia alone, it was compensation. As liberal democratic norms weakened globally, Turkey's internal contradictions sharpened. Power concentrated in the executive. Institutions bent toward loyalty. Stability was prioritized over deliberation. Elections continued, but the space around them narrowed. Supporters called this realism. Critics called it erosion. Both were partially correct. Turkey's leadership framed authority as necessity in a hostile world surrounded by conflict, terrorism, migration crises, and geopolitical competition. The argument resonated with a population historically shaped by survival. Fear has deep roots in Anatolia, yet fear is a poor architect of trust. Civil society adapted rather than vanished. Cultural production flourished quietly. Youth negotiated identity, fluidly religious but global, national but skeptical, digitally connected yet historically burdened. Women challenged boundaries. Local governments experimented within constraints. Turkey did not stagnate, it strained. The East-West dichotomy persisted, but increasingly as a political instrument rather than a cultural truth. Europe became a mirror reflecting rejection and aspiration. The Middle East became a stage of influence and warning. Russia, China, and the global South offered alternatives, but not belonging. Turkey stood alone, not isolated, but unanchored. What makes this moment distinct is not crisis, but choice, compression. Options exist, but each carries cost. Liberalization risks fragmentation. Centralization risks legitimacy. Tradition offers continuity, but resists pluralism. Modernity promises opportunity, but demands openness. Anatolia has faced this before. Empires resolved such tensions through hierarchy. The Republic resolved them through rupture. The present offers neither luxury. Authority must now coexist with participation. Identity must tolerate multiplicity. Power must explain itself. This is Turkey's unfinished future, not a return to empire, not a submission to external models. not a simple continuation of the Republic's founding logic, but a renegotiation. The land that once absorbed Persians, Greeks, Romans, Byzantines, Turks, and Ottomans now absorbs global currents with the same instinct it always had: selective adaptation. Turkey does not copy civilizations, it translates them. Whether that translation can occur without coercion remains the open question. Turkey endures because it always has, but endurance alone is no longer sufficient. Meaning must be renewed, not enforced. Authority must persuade, not merely command. Identity must be expansive enough to breathe. Anatolia has survived every certainty imposed upon it. What it has never fully resolved is how to live with uncertainty by choice. The future of Turkey will not be decided by geography, religion, or history alone, but by whether a civilization built on synthesis can accept unfinishedness as strength rather than threat. That decision is still unfolding.